already. Thank you. And the invitation is, if you could rename yourself so that we can see your name and your organization ideally, that would be wonderful. You can do so when you hover over your own image here, and at Zoom there are 3 little dots. There you can press rename and then you can rename yourself. And I think that's all I need to say at the beginning. We're thrilled to have this session and continue the conversation about the pledge as well that already started in the opening session for anyone who joined that. Janet, can I hand over to you? You're muted.
Sorry. Welcome, everyone. We are really happy to see all of you in this session and looking forward to an exciting session. My name is Janet Maweo. I'm part of the team that is facilitating this conversation. As you know, in RINGO, we are testing out a couple of areas, and accountability is a major one. And that's why we are having this session, which is actually looking at a very interesting way or a very creative way of piloting or testing out a Southern-led approach to the decolonization conversation for INGOs using what we are calling Pledge for Change, which you're going to know about just shortly. I want to introduce the team that has been leading this process with Isabella, who will talk to us just in a few minutes, just now, telling us what it's about. Isabella Jean, and one of the other members is Rocio Moreno Lopez. We'll also hear from her shortly. Other members include Elena Nesik and Eliza Lopez, Dorina Luoch, I believe she is also present, and Deborah Willing, and Esther Devredo, they've both been doing a fantastic job of leading this prototype and exploring a very interesting conversation, which as we heard, is really at the center of how the aid industry is being delivered. And so welcome, everyone. We're happy to see many of you. I hope you're putting your name on the chat so that we can see where you're joining us from. Whatever time of day it is, please let's join in making this an interesting session. And so in this session, we're going to hear shortly from Isabella, who will tell us what the Pledge for Change is about. And then we will have a conversation to understand what that looks like in a real situation, and have a chance to look at or hear in a greater detail about the pledge itself, what has been emerging from that case, from on that side, and finally, converse and have a discussion about this in our real setting, so that this is not something it's actually real, and we want to draw from your own examples. So please join us in listening and in sharing your views as we go along. Without wasting any more or taking any more time, I'd like to invite Isabella to tell us what the pledge is about.
Thank you, Janet. Thanks everyone for joining us. I will share my screen right away so that we can take a look at some key details about the pledge before we jump into the accountability element. This was an interesting prototype because it was prototyping a mechanism, a Southern-led accountability and learning mechanism that will help reverse the imbalance that we all are familiar with in the aid sector, where a lot of the accountability initiatives have in fact been concentrated in the global north or led and centered around INGO or UN initiatives. And this mechanism will accompany an actual process that has been going since January 2021, which is the Pledge for Change, which Peter began telling you about. And I'll just spend a few minutes giving you a little bit more detail about the pledge, but the rest of the session today will focus on the accountability and learning mechanism that will accompany the pledge. So the pledge is a mutual commitment, a set of commitments and pledges towards building a stronger aid ecosystem based on principles of solidarity, humility, self-determination, and equality. We've worked on the pledges for about 18 months. There was, a lot of process elements in it in terms of gathering input from partners of the INGOs who were part of the process, from their staff. We brought in Global South leaders, executive directors from organizations in the Philippines, India, Haiti, Sierra Leone, Palestine, and many, many other places to join the process at the really key moments. And Adesso has been convening this entire process from day one. Unfortunately, Degan Ali is not able to be with us today. She's on a plane right now in transit. Otherwise, it would have been incredible for you to hear directly from her. I'm only serving a role of a bridge here between Adesso team and the RINGO lab, and have been accompanying this process, and happy to share with you some of what we tested and the lessons. The pledges focus on 3 key areas. One is on equity in partnerships, and it's not just about resource transfers or increasing or sharing an equitable share of flexible and unrestricted funding. That is part of it, but there's a lot more to it in terms of a real partnership and solidarity, and a real commitment by these signatory INGOs that by 2030, they will be doing no direct implementation unless they are asked to deploy and have direct implementation on the ground. The commitment being that they will always seek out local organizations to partner with before they open country offices and so on. The other area is authentic storytelling. It has to do with decolonizing imagery, storytelling narratives, and removing the white gaze from how fundraising materials and communication materials are produced and shared. And the third is a commitment by all signatory INGOs to influence their peers, their funders, the wider sector, the networks, and also influence their own government policies. So UK-based NGOs working with the UK government on broader policies that have to do with aid, trade, and some even political processes that can serve as barriers to equitable development. And just to answer some of your maybe initial questions here, we have 2 categories of supporters of the pledge. INGOs are invited to endorse the pledge as signatories, which means that they are committing to implementing those pledges, as well as using the shared set of metrics to transparently report and participate in that accountability process that we'll be talking about today. The initial group of organizations that had developed the pledges were CARE, Oxfam, Christian Aid, Plan, Save the Children. We've also had ActionAid and IRC part of this process at various points during the 18 months, and they are signatories as well. We are growing that list, and I'll let Doreen mention some of the new signatories at the end of the call if there's time. My colleague from Adesso team is here, and she's very much in charge of receiving those requests and inquiries, so she's the right person to speak. We're also inviting Global South networks, organizations, leaders, activists who are and allies in the global north. So organizations such as Interaction, which is a US umbrella of all American NGOs, has already endorsed the pledge. We hope that other networks such as Interaction will join us, as well as Global South networks like NEAR, Purposeful is in Sierra Leone, Humanitarian Aid International is in India. They have been accompanying us during the pledge development, and the list is going to grow. It's already a lot longer than what you see here on the screen. I'll stop there. That's just basic information about the pledge, and I think David wanted to see if there's any questions before we jump into the accountability.
Exactly. Thank you, Isabella. Yeah, we just thought it would be great to just open the space up for a minute to check if you have any questions about the pledge for change itself after Isabella's presentation. The rest of the time, we will really much more focus on the accountability mechanism for the pledge. Just to open up the space, if you have any questions, you can put it in a chat. You can raise your hand. It's under reaction down in the Zoom. It's one of the Zoom functions down here. Under reactions, raise your hand, and then I could call on you if there are any questions. And it was actually only launched last week, right? On the 27th, I think, right?
Yes,
So
thank you,
it's
David.
really,
Yes.
this is brand new, really.
I should mention that we did have the public launch just Thursday, less than a week ago. And it has been recorded, and the video will be on the Pledge for Change website if it's not already. And please take the time to watch it, because you will hear directly from Degan, from Cherner Ba from Purposeful, one of the Global South leaders who's been accompanying the process, as well as key INGO CEOs who have been part of this retreat. We've been meeting since January 2021 for 3-hour monthly retreats, where the CEOs, just like Peter Walton and others, have shared many professional and personal reflections on what the decolonizing journey means to them, and began working on these pledges. And it has been an incredible privilege to accompany this process as a facilitator for myself, and support Odessa on this process. If there are no other questions, maybe we could move on to the accountability.
Exactly, and I would first invite actually Rocio to come in to speak about why do we need to do accountability differently. Rocio Moreno Lopez, she's also part of the prototyping team, and she's executive director of Accountable Now. Obviously an organization which has been working on accountability and how accountability is done in the sector more broadly for many years already. So Rocio, when we think about accountability in the sector, why do we need to do things differently? Basically, that's the question.
Hi everyone. Good morning for those in the US and Eastern time, but good afternoon. So yes, as David said, I'm Rocio Moreno. I'm the executive director of Accountable Now. It's been a privilege to be part of this prototype and to see finally the pledge come to life and see what we're trying to aim. So maybe just answering David's question. And before Isabella introduces you to the actual accountability mechanism, I wanted just to take some time to give us a very brief overview of where we are and what is it exactly that the pledge and a lot of us are actually trying to achieve. So historically speaking, and I'm not going to take us way back, I promise, accountability in our sector has been primarily top driven. It's usually been driven by the funder community or really by power holders. The other big characteristic is that accountability has been confused with due diligence or compliance processes, and a lot of reporting, a lot of huge emphasis around reporting and not really understanding what reports mean, what is the emphasis and what we should be doing with that information. Recent years, many initiatives like the one I represent, Accountable Now, we've been reflecting on and trying to answer questions such as how can we use accountability as a mechanism that allows us to tackle all of the systemic challenges that our sector is facing at all levels. One of them being, of course, the colonialism, recent years, a lot of issues around safeguarding, racism, Me Too movement, among many others. Another question is how can we use accountability to redress power imbalances, which is something that Isabella was talking about, and she will for sure talk about when she presents the mechanism. The other is how can we make sure that power is redressed to those impacted by our actions, but also by the work that we as a sector are carrying out. And I think there the main question is how can we use accountability as a lever for change? So it's in these lines that the Pledge for Change was built on. And primarily it sets an emphasis on redressing the power equation between international local organizations. This is not only done through metrics, and you will see this. I promise I am not giving any spoilers, but it's really done by making sure that local organizations can hold their peers to account. The pledge is a wonderful step towards decolonizing aid, but this is just really the beginning. Accountability mechanisms are not the end. They're really the beginning of a very long journey where learning and change should be emphasized. And I think that it's really just, and this is where I'm going to end, it's really our task, all of us, not just local organizations, all of us sitting here in this space, our peers, our organizations, to make sure that the journey really fosters change, and not only change is reflected in actions, but it actually embraces and changes our organizational cultures. We really need to change our mindsets. And that's where I really want to put the emphasis. Let's use the pledge as the beginning to engage in dialogue, not only with international organizations, but also with donors and with other peers who are also power holders and that are continuing to replicate a lot of the problems that we currently have within our sector. And I'm going to stop there. And now, if I can hand over either to David or Isabella so that you can start getting a bit more of a flavor of what this accountability mechanism looks like.
Thanks, Horacio. It's interesting because exactly this balance of it's not only about an accountability mechanism, but it's an accountability mechanism that fosters learning. So how can we include that, this element really well, was really part of the conversation as well. Isabella, over to you. I think we're all would love to hear a little bit more. What are the elements that are under development?
All right, let me bring this back. All right. I just want to mention one thing. The discussion about accountability and learning in this kind of a collective action, collective impact process that involves really large organizations, as you can see on this list. It's not just one CARE member office, it's the entire CARE family, the entire Oxfam family, all of the members and affiliates, Plan, Save the Children. ActionAid has 47 chapters. It's quite a massive undertaking, and the conversation that we've started, both on the pledges, obviously all through the process, and on the accountability, is not complete. The accountability and learning mechanism is still under construction, and the prototyping team, the members of which are here on this call, Rocio including, and others, were incredibly helpful in getting that early thinking in terms of what that might look like. These were the two questions that we were driven by right from the start. How might we design a system that also holds INGOs accountable to their local partners and other civil society actors, as well as by extension, government actors as well in places where they operate. And exactly the actors who they seek to support and partner with. And what could that innovative Southern-led, Southern-hosted learning and accountability mechanism that shifts that power imbalance and helps to redress it look like? What are the elements and the conditions and the various ingredients that would require? So that's where we started with, in a number of really great creative brainstorming sessions facilitated by Janet and David. These are just some visuals to show you our work. And early on, we were not all in one room, as you can imagine. All of this was on Zoom, but we drew and we wrote and we created. We just tried to break out of just words on paper or words on screen and think about what are some of those ingredients and what do we need to learn and take from what we already know on collective accountability, and what we could try to really innovate on and create some new ways of sharing information, learning, and so on, especially given the large sizes and the extent of these organizations. Even the coffee cup here was metaphorically representing something, except I don't remember exactly all the details. Maybe during the small breakout sessions, one of our members can tell you. But our initial parameters and sort of desired conditions, what we wanted to see in this mechanism when we would first set out, and when Adesso team wrote the proposal to the RINGO lab, were exactly some of the things I already mentioned. We wanted to be informed by good practices and collective accountability, but also with recognition that many of previous efforts didn't work or became too concentrated in the north by donors, by other initiatives, or became very minimalistically limited to self-reporting. So, or verification and self-reporting sort of exercises. We wanted to draw from Global South models of accountability, and Elena Nessik's research on that was really foundational for our thinking as well. She was one of the members of our group who did some external sort of desk review of what is known on deliberative democracy models and so on. We also invited as many people into this process, not always in the prototyping team meetings, but input from other times in the Pledge for Change development, from local partners, from practitioners, and so on. We wanted the mechanism to be housed and managed by a Global South entity and include third-party independent information and verification or review and feedback, whatever, you know, we decided that would be at the end, as well as peer-to-peer learning, where CEOs were already doing that as part of the pledge, calling on each other and their senior colleagues from fundraising, partnership, and other units were already doing that. We wanted that to continue once the pledge gets launched and be part of that learning mechanism. And also we wanted it to be fit for purpose, because as you can see from the list is growing. There'll be many more signatories and allies, and this accountability mechanism needs to make sense in that kind of a growing collective action. What we currently have under construction are these three key areas which are interlinked. There will be self-reporting on a set of shared metrics, and you'll hear a little bit more about it from one of the INGO representatives here who has been working with peers on those metrics. So annual reporting following a baseline next year. There will also be very much embedded, interlinked into the self-reporting, partner and local community feedback where possible. And the partner feedback will be collected by an independent entity, and we're still nailing down what that's going to look like and what that entity is. There's several that we could be relying on, but they're not currently based in the Global South. And there's a really strong interest, not just from Adesso, but also from the signatories to be working with a M&E partner or another entity in the Global South to help collect that independent feedback from local partners. So we're still working that bit out, and we'll be launching the details in the new year. And the piece that we're currently keeping, because we've already tested some elements of that, is a rotating advisory group / peer review panels, and there may be multiple. That's why you see the multiples here, that will be helping to sit down and review those annual reports and to engage in future retreats directly with the CEOs and leadership teams, give feedback to them on specific things that have been submitted. And you'll hear a little bit more about it when we talk about the metrics, but I'll give you just one example maybe. On the authentic storytelling pledges, which is an area where changes in practices related to visuals, storytelling, how campaign materials, fundraising materials, any sort of public communication is done. There aren't currently many metrics that INGOs use to look at the equity and authentic nature of how the stories are represented. There's commitments to do that, but not yet enough metrics to draw on. So we're creating brand new set of metrics on some of this. And in order for it not just to be self-reported, we will be putting together a review panel of communication, media, decolonization experts from the Global South to look at those images and reports. For example, 10 most viewed materials from each INGO signatory, once a year or twice a year. And that would be a particular review panel just focused on that, on the authentic storytelling. There'll be also a larger rotating Global South advisory group, and we've tested that in a smaller way already throughout the pledge development. I've mentioned quite a few of these things already. I just want to mention that the peer-to-peer learning at the very last bullet here, we've tested bits of it since this summer as part of the ongoing hunger response, Horn of Africa response in Somalia, parts of Ethiopia and Kenya. There are a lot of signatory organizations that are already working there and are part of that response. So we've hosted a series of conversations about what would pledge application look like. This is before the actual launch. So starting in June, in August, in September, we had a series of calls with representatives of signatory organizations, starting the conversation on both how would you do your equitable partnership practices in this response as a signatory? How would you change the way you're fundraising for this response? And how are you influencing your peers and so on? It was an interesting set of conversations with the right people to share good practices, promising practices, and so on. Not necessarily the decision-making conversation in terms of committing to some really different ways of working. So we will continue on that. But it provided us with a platform for testing some of what the future accountability and learning mechanism process might look like, peer-to-peer learning in particular, that element. This is where I think I really wanted to bring in Jay Golden from CARE International, who's a senior M&E specialist, and he worked with many other peers from the signatory organizations from Oxfam, Plan, Christian Aid, and many, many others. One of the lessons for us right from the start was that metrics are technical, and usually M&E people are the ones who sit down and work on them with collaboration from other staff. But in this case in particular, given that the pledges were about elements that are not currently being measured or not to the extent that we want, we had to involve senior and expert staff from partnership units, communication specialists, fundraising, advocacy, as well as CEOs, all of them reviewing and inputting into the metrics. And Jay, can I just pass on to you now to share some reflections on what that process looked like from your side, as well as what you think is needed for signatory organizations to adjust their, not just metrics, but M&E systems and ways of doing accountability?
Thanks, Isabella. And yes, I mean, I think it's been really great hearing. I mean, I think Rocio framed it really nicely, that this system should be about really redressing power imbalances, and it should be a system, as Isabella was saying, that's about learning and change, and goes beyond the kind of business as usual approach that we've seen in a lot of kind of these global reporting mechanisms where organizations sign up to big commitments, and then kind of a lot of the spirit and the power behind the original agreement gets lost in the technicalities of what is ultimately measured and arguments about what different things mean, etc. So we've really tried as a kind of collective of the INGO M&E folk and the technical folk, working with Isabella and her team and some of the Southern partners she talked about, to make sure that at the heart of at the heart of how we're going to measure whether the Pledge for Change leads to change has to be the perceptions of our local partners. And do they see that our partnerships are becoming more equitable? Do they see that we are telling more authentic stories? We are involving them more in our stories and our wider communications? And do they feel that we are influencing the system to be less colonial? And so that kind of, she showed those three circles of the sector. I think the biggest one and the most important one has to be that kind of partner perception piece. We also do need to include some of the things that we can report on and measure ourselves, because that's also a way that we can kind of more quickly perhaps drive change in our own organizations. And so we feel there's a role for that self-reporting as a complement to the perception of partners. And that needs to be a kind of mixture of quantitative things like, how much money is channeled through local partners, And then perhaps some more qualitative examples of where we can show how we're profiling the role and contribution and importance of local partners, say, and how we communicate about the work that we do. And then finally, that piece around, you know, more of a Southern-led expert review process, you know, so rather than us saying, here's our 10 most seen images, and our analysis on these is that they live up to the spirit of the pledge, why don't we actually hire some experts from the Global South to look at those and tell us what they think and what their recommendations are? And that feels much more aligned with the spirit of the pledge than trying to appear like we're doing the right thing and using only our own words to do so. I think one of the complicated aspects that Isabel has alluded to is that we're very different organizations. So we have a number of kind of multi-member confederations like Oxfam or CARE. We have single-member organizations like ICR and Christian Aid. We have kind of partnership default organizations like Christian Aid and others who have a bit more of a mixture. And so it's complicated coming up with things that we can all agree on, that we can agree on definitions around, that we're all capable of measuring, or we can imagine measuring. So there's a lot of kind of complications in trying to come up with something that works for everyone or works for a large enough group of us, but that is also meaningful and isn't just business as usual, and is trying to push us to do much more than we're currently doing, and push us to make real movement in line with the spirit and the words and the commitments of the pledge. So I think I'll leave it there, Isabella, for now.
Thank you, Jay. That's really, really helpful. Indeed, the size and the diversity of organizations, and which will only grow again as, let's say, much smaller organizations join in and sign on, is important to keep in mind. We didn't want to, right from the start, or really ever, negotiate this process down to the lowest common denominator and the easiest thing to measure that everybody's already measuring. We did take a look. We spent some time looking at what are you all measuring, and it was really interesting to see that a number of signatory organizations are already proposing, have already developed experimental new ways of measuring equity in partnerships, for example, which they're putting in place either this fall or as the new year starts. So there was a lot of ongoing development within these organizations already on some new ways of measuring things related to localization, equity, and so on. And so this commitment for the metrics to be a stretch, for them to be a little bit difficult, or quite a bit difficult for some, is still there. However, we also want to build enough flexibility to allow smaller organizations, or ones that haven't had enough time on their M&E systems yet, to catch up and to work with each other. So we are going to keep that flexibility all through 2023 and allow some organizations to pilot these metrics, perhaps in a part of their federation, let's say among the several select members, piloting the metrics, and then helping the entire confederation to catch up and put them into their systems overall. So those are still things to be negotiated. That's why parts of this, some of the decisions and some of the elements are still under construction. Let me move just a little bit more on the pledge before we go into on the accountability. One of the decisions we've made is that Adesso will incubate the accountability and learning mechanism for the first 2 years. It is not what Adesso wanted from the beginning. They would have wanted to help design the ingredients, elements for this prototype, and then hand over to another entity right from the start. But we didn't have a strong candidate emerging right from the start. So ADESA will incubate it and will fundraise for the key functions of this mechanism. And then the plan is to hand over to another network or another organization in the Global South. The rotating advisory review group that we mentioned with CSO experts will be remunerated. Of course, also very much we're linking to the fundraising goals that we now have ahead of us. And it will also be made of pledge supporters, you know, the second category that I shared with you, where allies and networks can join and become supporters and endorsers of the pledge. One of the expectations there is that you're not just endorsing with a signature and put your organization's name on the website, but you also perhaps lend your expertise and serve on that rotating advisory group for a year, or if you have expertise in media and communications, you join that review panel to review the marketing materials that Jay was talking about. So we'll be reaching out to the supporters, those who endorse the pledge as supporters, to engage them in the accountability and learning mechanism. We also plan to stay involved with the RINGO Lab members. There are other prototypes that you will be hearing about this week, for example, on decolonizing advisory services, where there's a really natural link and a potential for collaboration and tapping into the expertise and the advisors that will be assembled as part of that service. And when we launched, Dagan made it clear last Thursday in her opening and closing remarks that the pledge for change and its accountability dimension is really, really important, because many other commitments before have not lived up to the expectations, and they can't just be aspirational. They have to have real teeth and real transparent and radical transparency to it. So that's where we're heading next in 2023 in terms of what this mechanism will look like. And we really hope that funders and donors as well pay attention to this. I already mentioned on the flexibility and piloting. Happy to answer any questions, or David, if you wanted to move us into breakout rooms, I think it's over to you. That was my last slide. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Isabella, and Jay actually as well, being part of this conversation. And I think that this is really interesting, and it gives a couple of food for thoughts to all of us. And what we would love to invite you now is to take this into a reflective conversation in smaller groups, because we obviously we can continue to ask how the pledge do this, how was this accountability mechanism set up. But we think the broader question here is as well, is what are we learning about accountability more broadly for the sector? So two reflective questions that I would love to give you for your breakout rooms. The first being, what are we learning from this for reversed accountability more broadly in the sector? And the second would be, what could you pick up in your organization? So kind of a little bit kind of, what are you inspired by this? Perhaps also what feels challenging about picking this up more strongly in your organizations. So we're going to go into breakout groups, and afterwards we come together and have a conversation with each other. So before more people leave the conversation, because they were just prepared to listen, we're going to move to breakout rooms now for actually 20 minutes. So make sure in your breakout groups to speak about these two questions and give everybody a chance to speak in your group. Welcome back. Janet, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you. I hope you had vibrant conversations like we just did in our small group, and we'd like to give ourselves a few minutes just to hear some of the highlights. What takeaway? What came out? Especially something that you feel is striking that we need to think about. And since we all can't talk, it would be okay to also put some of it in the chat as we wait to see who would be offering to kick us off in this conversation. Otherwise, I'll offer someone from my group, shall I? Oh yeah, I can see Melissa, you're ready. Good, great. Melissa, you want to do that?
Okay, so just some key points from our group. There were a lot of deep reflections, but the key learnings were, I think one was that peer support is needed right from the inception of projects and programs to the implementation. And there was just this remark that, I mean, there's a lot of peer support around the inception of programs, but we need that same peer support to carry through the implementation of programs. And we also highlighted that there is a lot of commitment to pledge, like, because I mean, we have had quite some commitment to pledge, but the question is, how eager are we to boldly act on the pledges that we are making, and just take the bold steps to defeat the fear of failure. And another thing that we also capture is that we have not adequately thought about where we are going and conceptualize what the end goal is. And a question that I really liked is, how will we know when we are there? How will we know that we have achieved what we want? And I think that that was very striking to us, just to reflect around, to define what the end looks like. And just another contribution that came in so strong was just redefining the definition of what INGOs and what currently we see success to be, away from expansion and more into impact. And we even went ahead to say theoretically impact means shrinking, but this shrinking doesn't only mean becoming smaller in size, but it's also about just a redefinition of roles. So those are some of the conversations that we had in our group. I left a few seconds earlier. Sorry, I was kicked out. But I don't know whether I was able to capture most of the points. My colleagues can join. Thank you. It was a wonderful group.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Bonnie, did we forget anything, or that's about it?
I think Melissa did a great job.
Okay, great. Any other group want to give us some of the highlights, or even a question of what they discussed? What you're taking away? What blocks you see? Yeah. In the takeaway conversation, what came out? What are we taking away? Yes, Lisa, thank you.
Thanks. We had a great group with Nats, Zave, and Jay. And we were kind of talking about where is each of our organizations, like in a really concrete way, like how are we trying to move forward in this and shifting this power in accountability. And so Jay shared about being a confederation of organizations and how representation, for example, in the confederation has increased from the South, global South versus global North. But it's still like having to come to agreements or having conversations are still so complex because of the regional and local needs and ways of looking things. So, you know, moving forward, but really trying to figure out the nuts and bolts of that. Jay, feel free to add in. And then Nat too shared a really specific example that stood out to me. And that was like, okay, so if we're talking about this shift, the global, you know, where is the global office of the organization? It's very often in the global North, and then you have regional offices, and even looking at the difference between how regional offices are set up, how are they staffed, how are they funded versus a global office? Are the regional leaders really equals at the table? You know, and how can we even internally start to work on some of these power differentials and take steps towards that even before we start working externally or at the same time?
Thank you. Actually, you are bringing out that whole point that this is a very serious inside conversation, and we have to begin with ourselves. It's not something out there before it starts with ourselves. And so we have to engage with it deeply and genuinely and very authentically so that we can begin to take some action, practical action. I'm ready to take one more. David, I hope you're still okay with time. I'm not very good.
We've got plenty of time, Janet.
Ah, okay, great. Yeah. One of the interesting conversations which emerged is that one around engaging with what that end game, what are we trying to achieve? What is different? What is that different result we hope to achieve through this process? And are we ready to think about it, to actually face it? And there was a conversation around, could it mean a bit of shrinking? And if it is shrinking, are we ready? Is it shrinking? Is it re-engineering ourselves? Are these conversations that we are ready to take up and maybe think about playing different roles, not the one we've always traditionally played? Is that something we are ready to engage with? I'm looking for one hand of someone who wants to comment or.
Yeah, it's Alex here.
Yes.
In our group, we had quite a few questions. Isabella was talking about how to bring the governance of each of our organizations on board, and that it's our own internal work, but it's also an internal organizational change work, and that takes time and advocacy and commitment and tools. So it's very sort of multi-layered. So I found that quite interesting about the process that is different within each organization. That was some of the things that we.
Thank you, Alex, for that. Very, very true. I think governance is one of the very complex things, and yet it is so fundamental because it drives the organization. So if you don't engage with it, you may find that you have the wrong vehicle, maybe for the new vehicle or for the new work. And it means also that group of people who are often not as engaged in the real work in this, wherever the action is, actually have a good understanding of what is happening, where do we want to go, what needs to change. So these are very serious conversations that we must be ready to engage with if we are expecting anything to change. Actually, we were reminded about the fact that we've had all these, we've had other initiatives, and the question was, what is different about this initiative? Why will this work? What are we doing differently so that in the end, we actually, begin to tilt that clock that needs to move. And a lot of it has to do with action, dealing with some of those things. Now we are talking about the governance, beginning a very deep reflection, being action-oriented as opposed to just, it's not about theory, it's not about a document, it's about us changing our ways of working. How do we get that to happen? Any other ideas or thoughts? Is there anything in the chat I'm missing? I'm not good at multitasking on this, not quite okay. Are there any, one of the questions which was running through my mind somewhere along the line is there a change that needs to happen in Global South which will actually enhance this? Are the Global South actors ready to carry this forward? Or is there anything? Bonnie, I see you nodding. What are you thinking?
I actually don't want to comment on that, Janet, because I'm not from the Global South. But I have heard this conversation. I think it's an important one. That's just why I was nodding.
Okay. Who from Global South would like to comment on this? Is there any groundwork that needs to happen simultaneously while this is happening? I don't want to preempt it. I'm a Global South person, but I would love to point at Nancy. What is your take?
Thank you, Janet. I think I keep asking myself how many Global South organizations I've been committing to in the first place. and are they ready? And it requires us to also, in the same energy, have this kind of conversation with them, and appreciate their mindset shifts about this whole accountability. So we need to really have deep dive conversation with Global South actors, know where their line of thought and whether they're also ready to embrace this in the first place. And if they are ready, what support do they need to take on? Because it's not something they've been doing for a long time. And now they are to lead this initiative. What capacity do they need to do that? Or they already have the capacity, but how are they going to channel their messaging to Global North? So I think this conversation needs to really move to the grassroots, needs to move down to the Global South more, and engage all the actors that are needed.
Thank you, Nancy. I've seen Alice. Alice is very conversant with this. Alice, you're not going to escape. And as Alice thinks, I do. Thank you, Nancy. I actually think while a lot of action needs to move in the North, I think there is a lot of room to nurture a certain change of mind, or a shift of the way, you know, people in the South have always expected maybe to be guided or to be told or whatever. Something needs to change, and I'm very happy to see Matt. Matt, I'd like to give you a chance to comment on this. You've been based in the South for a long time.
Hi, Janet. Good to see you. I'm from the global North, but sitting in, I guess, the global South today here in Nairobi. I have sort of a half-formed thought around this. I'm going to share it anyway. We've been thinking quite a bit about accountability and community kind of feedback loops in our organization. And when we talk to our colleagues around the world about this, they say, but we already have feedback loops. We go and have coffee with the community or tea in the communities that we work with, or we share a meal and we talk about what's going on and we get their feedback and we respond to it. So now you're coming to us as an organization, you want to maybe institutionalize accountability and feedback. And there's kind of I think there's an interesting cultural dynamic, because metrics and accountability is maybe quite a Western or global North concept. And so we've had this issue, around sort of, well, we already have accountability. We see you every week, we talk to you over a meal, we tell you what's going on. If you don't follow up on it, then we see you next week and we talk to you about it again. And I think there's an interesting dynamic here that we have to, that's going to come into play with sort of a global standard around accountability and feedback as well.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that perspective. I think it's a very real one. I see a hand from Ebenezer.
Yes. Okay, so this is Ebenezer. Great. Okay, so firstly, let me thank everybody. I joined today. Today was when I actually joined this platform. So mine has been to observe, to learn what is going on. So, but then when he talked about the Global South, not specifically on the topic, one thing that has been of interest to me, I'm talking from Ghana, is that the Global South has always, when it comes to giving support to local projects or change-making activities, we tend to always want to look at the global North. And if support doesn't come from the global North, then means that nothing happens. And we always want to fall on the others for support services in terms of local activities and all that. For me, in the long term, I think that we have to start thinking about raising resources internally. I mean, the global North South having to always support seek support from the Global North is a challenge that in terms of the long term, you might have to do something about. And if you realize they're discussing about shifting the power, and it has to continue, and consistently we have to work at it. Because really, if we always want to look out there for support, psychologically it has effect on that. And what the Global North bring home in terms of development activities, the ownership becomes a challenge. The ownership becomes a challenge to the extent that whatever projects are done, the people in the communities always think that it is somebody to do. It is somebody to do. To that extent, we don't see ourselves in our own development. So that where there's a shortfall, as we have today,
we seem to have lost Ebenezer. Ebenezer, I think we've lost you. Yeah. But I think we hear where Ebenezer was going. I think he was getting into the fact that resources is one of those things that will need to be raised in a more diverse manner than just looking at resources as coming from the North. And there's something empowering, which increases also ownership when resources are also raised where you are working. So I think his point was really around the need to also think about the question of resources as an aspect. And I think that is something that many of us have experienced, that it does empower communities and organizations when they also have resources and they can be on the table also confidently. But I think and David there is reminding us that there's actually a session on grant making that we'll be looking at that. So, there are many aspects, I think, of all these areas, and I think it's good to recognize that it's not just looking at one, and that's a good thing about what we are doing within RINGO, because there are many angles to this conversation, and I think it's opening our minds to the fact that while a lot of change needs to happen in the Northern organizations to push that accountability, there is also work of nurturing the right attitude, the ground, so that the people from Global South are also able to take more responsibility. And for me, one of the examples I often give is, if for years you spent crushing, let me use the word crushing, if for many years Global South actors have many times been crushed and made to think in a certain way, one has to invest deliberately in growing that confidence and that space, that way of thinking, that more open way of looking at the fact that that it's time to take more responsibility. So with that, I think we are at a good space to to hand this back to Isabella. Maybe she can help us round up, and I hope some of the conversation is enriching what the work that Isabella and her team have been doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Absolutely. It has been incredibly valuable to hear all of your inputs in this session, earlier in the breakouts and in the chat. I know we just have a few minutes left, but I wanted to start by thanking all of the prototyping team members, starting with David as our process coach, who always kept us on track, and Janet for all of your substantive inputs and expertise and wisdom. Rocio, Eliza from Accountable Now, Deborah Willick from Interaction, who also brought in both Accountable Now and Interaction, brought in their experience and observations from ongoing or recent efforts of instituting either different kind of reporting mechanisms and engaging multiple organizations in that collective learning and accountability, and at Interaction, where they recently put in place diversity, equity, and inclusion related commitments for all of the members of Interaction. There were a lot of reflections on what that took and how that process unfolded that we learned from as well. It's been great to work with Elena Nesic as an expert as well, and Adesso team members who were able to join the process. So thank you to all of you. It's been a really great collaboration. And on some of the comments, and just as closing remarks, I do want to say a couple of things. We do not want this to come across as an easy process. It wasn't. In fact, the pledges are not as ambitious as we would have wished. And after 18 months of process and lots of input and comments and consultations across this very, very large organizations, of course, some of the early aspirations and ambitions, were lowered in order to achieve and get to the point where we are. There is still a lot of aspiration and a lot of space for some incredible change if organizations take those bold actions that Janet and others were mentioning. And as you saw from Peter's comments, I know he didn't finish saying what all the pledge meant for him at Care Australia, but other leaders who've been there at that retreat table, I have seen them truly, truly personally and professionally reflect and make commitments to move their organizations as far as possible from harmful and unhelpful practices and towards equity, accountability, and true solidarity. So if that means reducing in size, many of them have already begun those conversations. One important lesson, this is kind of related to your comments on where we're heading, what is the actual kind of goal. One important lesson on the metrics related to this accountability discussion we're in here is that when we try to come up, and when I say we, it doesn't mean a DESO team. In fact, it was their staff who were in the working groups. When we tried to set fixed targets, quantitative targets for 2030. So the pledges have the statements, and then they have this accompanying targets that would, that said by 2030, this percentage of our projects will be implemented through local partners. And, obviously it would have been great to have that at 100%, but we had a pretty high number there and so on. There were other examples. That became quite a difficult one because of such variety of organizations and sizes and differences in their restricted, unrestricted funding and so on. So we've shifted to metrics instead, but we haven't lost that intent to set targets for 2030. The goal right now is after the baselines are done at some point in 2030, we will sit down for a difficult, again, conversation and push ourselves to actually establish some fixed targets, quantitative targets on some of these areas that truly, truly matter to Global South organizations. Because it's really, when you start seeing those targets and when you see those metrics is when the pledges become real. Right now, if you go to the Pledge for Change 2030 website and read the pledge statements, they're hard to disagree with. They are easy to endorse. It's the targets and the metrics that make it real. And so we will continue to push the organizations to think about that goal and the trajectory and that destination where we're heading. So that's a promise from the ADESO team that we are going to continue on that. Other than that, I'm really hopeful that there will be many, many different ways to engage with many more Global South organizations, because one other thing that this wasn't an extensive Global South consultative process. This was a process convened by ADESO, a Somali organization based in Nairobi, with input and participation from Global South experts. But it wasn't this extensive ground level bottom up process, which is what Degan did not want to repeat what she saw and participated in during the Grand Bargain consultations in 2015, 2016, which involved hundreds of Global South organizations giving their input, comments, sweat, blood, and tears into that process, only to see those commitments go up the chain of command and decision making and be diluted and be negotiated down to lowest common denominator. So what ADESO did not want to do is to do performative participation as performance, inviting many, many more organizations, but then ending up with INGO final decisions on what they would pledge to. So we put it squarely into the INGO hands and said, this is your pledge. And then brought in comments and feedback and input from Global South leaders in the process. But now that the pledge is there, final and launched, 2023 is when we really want to make it more participatory and consultative, more than it has been, during the pledge development. And we invite all of you on this call, your colleagues, your allies, your network members to engage. Doreen, if I could just ask you to take 1 minute to mention how people should be in touch with Adesso about it. Are you able to unmute yourself and mention that? Maybe not. Okay. My colleague Doreen is on the call, but I think she's not able to unmute right now. We invite you to visit the Pledge for Change 2030 website, and there will be clear instructions on how to be in touch with the team at Adesso if you want to be a supporter of the pledge or a signatory. And if you can't find that information, send an email. That all of the contact information is there and a way to be in touch. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all of your time. Thanks, Toa, for posting it.
Thank you. This is great. Thank you, Isabella, again. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to the prototyping team. Thanks for Rocio, Isabella, and Jay for contributing. We've got a couple of great other sessions lined up. Where there is my agenda slide. So just as a reminder, there's a half-an-hour break now, and then we've got 2 more prototyping sessions, one on South meets North in PowerShift, a framework for effective participatory grant making. I think this is relating also to one comment that we heard earlier. And then another one on language and lexicon and the use of artificial intelligence in supporting to disrupt the narrative about expertise and capacity that we have in the sectors. And finally, then there is a reflection on day 1, a brief session with Jim at 4:45 GMT time. So please make sure to sign up to the other sessions. I'm looking forward to see you there. Thank you for joining and have a great day. We're going to close this session very soon now because we have to switch and prepare for the other sessions. Thank you all. And do make take the opportunity to make some noise around the pledge. I think this is a great initiative and let's all support that. And thank you, Isabella, specifically for sharing so openly and transparency also about the challenges behind it. It's not just a beautiful, easy process. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.